I'm Keegs, and I'm going to make a bold statement right off the top here and say that in Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, Qui Gon Jinn was the second most powerful Jedi in the Order. Now, this might just be my opinion, but let's get into my reasoning as to why I think this. Qui Gon Jinn is one of those characters like Darth Maul from Episode 1, who many fans really loved but didn't hardly get any attention and was mostly left a mystery. Maul went on to get revived in the animated series The Clone Wars, Star Wars Rebels, and even a cameo in the Solo movie. But for some reason, Star Wars always was very hesitant to talk about anything from the time period before The Phantom Menace. Even Maul has a lot of mysteries surrounding him from before that time, though we do get snippets from the Clone Wars. We did get a book called Master and Apprentice, which follows Obi-Wan Kenobi as the new Padawan of Qui Gon Jinn. And with this, I think this gives us a little more insight into Qui-Gon as a character and will help us piece together exactly how strong and where Qui-Gon lies on the scale of Jedi. In the book, Qui-Gon is someone who likes to look at the Force as a whole and doesn't really separate light from dark and kind of studies and embraces the Force as an entity. And his master, Count Dooku, was also very fascinated by the dark side, as we all know, because considering what happened to him ultimately, but because that was his master and that's who he was brought up under, he never really got reprimanded for looking too far into the dark side, unlike some other Padawans, which allowed him to explore a little bit further and just get an overall better understanding of the Force. Dooku's other apprentice, his older apprentice, was named Rael Averross, and Rael was someone who really struggled with conforming to the rules, and you could say he's even more like Dooku in the fact that he edges more on the dark side of things, and he's more like Dooku with the exception of the fact that eventually he's offered to kind of go over to the dark side, but he refuses and ultimately stays in the light. And this is a person that is best friends with the younger Padawan, Qui Gon Jinn. The reason I bring up all this backstory is so that we can get a better understanding of how Qui-Gon was raised and understand exactly how he views the Force and how he looks at it. Unlike the Jedi Order, who generally only look at the light side of the Force, he's able to look at the entire thing and kind of evolve with the Force as a whole. And I think that is the first reason as to why he ends up being so attuned and in sync with the Force. Yoda is a good example of someone who perfected using the light side of the Force, and I do believe this was likely one of the Jedi more powerful in the Force than Qui-Gon. But that being said, because Yoda was only using the light side, I believe the dark side was more elusive to him and clouded Yoda's judgment a little bit more than someone who was able to use both sides of the Force, even at a lesser efficiency. One of the main plot points in the book Master and Apprentice was that Qui-Gon was offered a position on the Jedi Council, and the book has him debating whether or not he wants to join, because he feels that he doesn't agree necessarily with everything the council does, but then at the same time he's like, well, maybe if I get on it, then I could change it from within. But that's important because it means he is strong enough and powerful enough and wise enough in the Force to sit on the Jedi Council, and even the Jedi Council recognizes his skill with the Force. Probably the biggest piece of evidence I have here is that in Episode 3, Yoda says,
"An old friend has learned the path to immortality."
Qui-Gon.
It's clear that unlike Obi-Wan and Yoda, Qui-Gon Jinn was killed. And he was killed before he was able to assimilate himself into the Force. But that being said, his understanding of the Force before he died was so profound that even after death, his consciousness was able to reform. And albeit he had to talk with another very powerful Force user to be heard, which was Yoda, he was able to communicate with Yoda at some point, and presumably Obi-Wan Kenobi and maybe some others here or there. But the fact that he was able to do anything at all after death was a feat of its own. We can tell by how surprised Obi-Wan is that up until this point, it's something that was thought of as probably impossible. So even if someone in the Old Republic could have done it, it's been hundreds of years, and nobody knows of anybody that could do this thing, which is why it seems so surprising. So for all intents and purposes, for the memories of every living creature in the galaxy right now, Qui-Gon's the first person to do this. Qui-Gon did lose to Darth Maul, but I think an important consideration here is that he was also the first person to fight a Sith Lord in literally 1,000 years, and no way of knowing those tactics and styles that would be used against him, and I think he did really well for the first Jedi to fight a Sith in 1,000 years. In fact, Obi-Wan won that fight, but not really because of his skill, but because he was able to surprise Maul and cut him in half. Even through the Clone Wars, Maul wasn't truly ever defeated except for Palpatine when he got bodied, and I definitely don't believe Qui-Gon was as strong as Palpatine, so that's not really saying much if the only person you lose to is Palpatine. Obi-Wan in his old age is able to defeat Maul pretty easily at the end, and I think it's pretty obvious that at this point Obi-Wan is stronger than Qui-Gon ever was, so I'm not arguing that no one ever grew to be stronger than Qui-Gon after his death, since I think there are definitely a few people that did that, but I'm just talking about Qui-Gon's power level compared to everybody else's in Episode 1, or at the time of his death. I feel like a popular thought might be that Mace Windu is stronger, and I'd have to concede that Mace was a better duelist, but I think overall force ability still goes to Qui-Gon. Mace constantly lets his judgment get clouded and get lost in a political nightmare, and I don't think he ever devoted quite the same amount of time to understanding the Force. Interestingly enough, Mace Windu was able to use the 7th lightsaber form, which is really just a combination of light and dark side techniques, and he was the only person to use that form, I should say, and not fall to the dark side. But that kind of also echoes my point that the more balanced you are between good and bad, or I should say light and dark, however you want to put it, then that makes you a better Force user overall, and I think Mace perfectly lets us see that in the way he uses the techniques of the light and the techniques of the dark. That being said, Mace was not able to will himself back into consciousness after he died, as far as we know. I also think it's important to know that Mace in Episode 1 is also a decade younger than the Mace from Revenge of the Sith and hasn't been battle-hardened by the Clone Wars yet, so he doesn't have quite as much battle experience yet. It makes me wonder what Qui-Gon would have done, though, in the Clone Wars, and if he would have done something differently or actually left the Order entirely because he disagreed with what they were doing. Though I guess if he was there, then he probably would have raised Anakin differently, who would have been a better person, since Qui-Gon could kind of understand the confliction that resides within Anakin and maybe help him to better process those feelings. But that's going way down the rabbit hole. So that's my basis for the statement I said earlier about Qui-Gon being the second strongest Jedi, just behind Yoda. And if you consider how just attuned to the Force you need to be to persist after death, then that narrows it down to a very small handful of people to begin with, and I think Qui-Gon is definitely the first one as well. I'm sure people are going to interpret it differently than I have, and this is just my speculation, but there were certainly people out there that were more powerful than the Jedi altogether. But what do you think? Do you agree with my estimation of Qui-Gon's ranking in the power level order in the Jedi Order? Or is there someone more powerful in the Jedi Order that you have a better basis for thinking that? But let me know down in the comments. I'm Keegs, and I will catch you all next time for some more Star Wars content.